Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Delighted you're taking time out of your Thursday evening. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a few seconds. We've got people filtering in. Thank you for being here. Happy holidays, everybody. Welcome. We'll get started in just a moment or two. All right. Looks like we're all pretty much here. So let's get things underway. Good evening, everybody. Again, welcome. Thank you for joining us. If you feel comfortable doing so, you may put where you are zooming in from in the chat, geographically, psychologically, whatever you want to do. My name is Jane Oneail. I own the company Culturally Curious. I specialize in putting together art appreciation programs like this one. I feel so honored to be able to do this work, and I'm grateful to the Chelmsford Public Library in Amesbury and Groton and Ashland and Tewksbury for coming together every month to help to present these programs, and extremely grateful to all of you for zooming in and listening in too. So when I first conceived of this month's program, it was about a year or so ago, and I thought, it's the holidays. How can you look at the holidays in a new way? And all I could think of was the Nutcracker and the ballet. And so I thought, aha, Edgar Degas and the ballet. This is your excuse to not go to the Nutcracker this month, okay? Or you can still go and enjoy it all. So tonight we are going behind the curtain at the Paris Opera with this fascinating artist. We'll be looking at some of art history's most beloved images, and we will see that Edgar Degas could make some pretty interesting, sometimes gritty, but almost always beautiful images of modern life. So we are in for a treat. Let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend our hour together. Here's our program overview. And I should mention too, we're going to do a deep dive into this image a little while later. So don't worry, I'm not skipping over it. It's a good one. We'll get started with a quick introduction to Edgar Degas, and we're just going to hit on some high biographical points that connect with what we're talking about tonight. And then this next section, not an impressionist. That's what he would tell you if he were alive today. We'll take a look at some of his most extraordinary works and sort of take apart, are they impressionists? Are they not? What else is going on here? How were they so revolutionary at the time? Then we'll turn our attention to Edgar Degas and women performing in particular. Try to unpack some sort of understanding about what was going on in these early images of performance with Edgar Degas, and then squarely zoom in on the ballet. We'll get a little bit of history about the ballet, particularly in Paris, and then we'll get into increasingly private spaces. We'll start off center stage, we'll go backstage, and then we'll go to the practice studios. We'll wrap things up with one work in particular, one that probably many of you have seen in a museum setting. It's called The Little Ballerina, age 14. And then Degas gets his final curtain. So we've got a lot to cover. Let's dive right in. Let's do our introduction to Edgar Degas. Now, I'm pronouncing it Degas, of course, because he was born in France. He was a Frenchman. He was born in 1834. So, Edgar Degas, here are some important things to know about him. He was born into a very wealthy family. This is a man that did not have to work. He didn't have to have a job, but he wanted to become an artist. And early on, his mother was very encouraging of this, but unfortunately, his mother passed away when he was just 13. We can use this little biographical point to potentially psychoanalyze him a little bit later on this evening. By the time he was done with high school, he already had an art studio in his bedroom. And when he finished high school, he registered to become an official copyist at the Louvre Museum. That must have been a pretty good gig for him. And then something pretty consequential happened to young Edgar Degas. But before I move on from this slide, let's just acknowledge these two images here. This is a part of a series of self-portraits that he did when he was in his early 20s. So like 1850s, really. And from these self-portraits, we sort of get a sense of who he is, right? He's kind of serious, maybe a little bit melancholy. What we will find out along the way is that he could be a little bit caustic as well. He was a tricky personality. But as I was saying, as a young man, something important happens to him as he's this young, aspiring artist. He gets an introduction to the artist that we see here. We see him in a self-portrait, and we see an example of his work, or two examples of his work on the screen. This is Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. And Ingres was a leading artist of the first half of the 19th century in France. He worked in this neoclassical style where we can see there are invisible brushstrokes. These are highly finished paintings, and they are shockingly beautiful, are they not? Here is Ingres from the 1850s, and we can see him looking rather serious here. Now, Degas never became Ingres' official student, but they did meet, and Ingres said something that was pretty consequential to young Degas. He said, "Draw lines, young man, and still more lines, both from life and from memory, and you will become a good artist." And we have an example of Ingres drawing here. We can see how fundamental it is to creating one of his paintings. So Degas would take this to heart. We're not going to see too many of his drawings tonight, but you'll see the result of his careful drawing in some of the images that we'll be looking at. From this moment forward, Degas continues his studies. He goes to the École des Beaux-Arts, the premier art school in Paris, if not all of Europe. And then from there, he goes on to Italy to study for 3 years. While he's in Italy, he gets what every young art student is after: exposure to the great Renaissance masters of like Michelangelo and Leonardo. And this image over on the left is a purported drawing by Leonardo da Vinci. I question it, but we can see that young Edgar Degas saw it while he was in Italy, and he made a very faithful copy, actually, maybe even a better rendering of that same portrait that we can see over here in his sketchbook. We can also see portrait heads. We can see jockeys on horseback. We can see men in action poses here. And so we get sort of this sense of the fact that young Edgar Degas was just kind of drinking it all in, absorbing as much as he could as a young man. Now, when he was in Italy, he started doing something that was a little bit unusual for young art students at the time. He would be confronted with a major work like this fresco from the 1480s that we see over here on the left. And instead of trying to make a faithful replica of everything that we see here, from the figures to the architecture to the linear perspective, Edgar Degas would just find one element of a work, and he would zoom in on that element and crop it and essentially make a portrait out of one figure from a much bigger composition. So we can see that he's found this little boy over here in red who is like a secondary, if not unnecessary, character in this whole story. And he's done a drawing just of that little boy that we can see over here on the right. And this instinct to examine somebody who is maybe undervalued or overlooked and imbue some humanity into that figure is something that Degas is especially good at. And this instinct to crop and frame in an interesting way is also it's the distinctly Degas mode of operation. So once he's done with all of this studying, he returns to France, and he has great aspirations as an artist. He wants to become a history painter, which in the hierarchy of the arts was like the top of the heap. It was the most prestigious kind of painting that you could do. This is an example of one of his attempts at early on in his career of history painting. This is a painting that's called The Young Spartans Exercising. And since we're among friends here, we can just be honest. This is a weird painting, right? It's not really a satisfying painting for any of us to look at, part of that is because Degas never sold it, not surprising, right? But also because he continued to rework these characters over many years, trying to make them look a little bit more modern. But essentially, what we're looking at is a story from Plutarch about how the young boys and the young girls from Sparta were considered essentially equal, and the girls were encouraged to be as physically active as the little boys. So we can see these young, semi nude girls who seem to be reaching out and inviting or perhaps even taunting these young nude boys over on the right. So we get the sense that they're about to like run a race or start wrestling together or something like this. And what's kind of cool about having this image is that it shows an early interest on Degas' part of athletic young women. And that's what we'll be looking at when we get to the ballet, right? And it also leads us in the direction of just talking about Degas and women in general. We already know he lost his mother at a very young age. What about Degas and women? What we are looking at here is a portrait that he did of his friend Mary Cassatt. Now, Mary Cassatt would later say that she hated this portrait. That's neither here nor there. Edgar Degas never gets married. He does have a couple of significant female friendships with fellow artists, most notably with this artist here, Mary Cassatt. They had about a 40-year-long friendship. Neither one of them ever married. Some art historians, like to speculate about the true nature of that friendship. Was it ever more than that? And the truth is, we will never know because Mary Cassatt burned their letters before she died, which might tell us something right there. But my 2 cents is that Mary Cassatt was too good for him. Now, Edgar Degas could be kind of a cruel friend to her sometimes. We know that he could disparage her work right to her. And we know of at least one instance where he picked up his brush and dramatically altered her painting. What does that say about the way he thought of his fellow artist, right? At the same time, he could be a great champion of her work. We know, for example, that he took her under his wing. And she was an outsider. She was a woman and she was an American. And he brought her into the circle of artists that would begin to exhibit their work together and would go on to be called the Impressionist artists. And he kind of solidified her place in the history of art by doing that. So when it comes to Degas, it is like really a mixed bag, right? It's like, what does he really think about women? We'll hear more about that over the course of this hour. Now, I mentioned that he exhibited with the Impressionists, but Degas himself, not an impressionist. That's what he would tell you. So, how do we understand this? Well, I have 2 images here of a fellow artist, a contemporary to Degas, and his name is Edward Manet, not to be confused with Claude Monet of water lily fame, another impressionist. Edward Manet, who we see here, was famous for kind of getting the ball rolling. He was like a proto-impressionist, not quite ever an impressionist, never really claimed to be, kind of like Degas that way. And so we can see in these 2 images by Degas a real interest and respect for his fellow artists, a very detailed etching over here, print, and then on the right, a fascinating family portrait where Edward Manet is just kind of crashed out on his couch here. And this is his wife who's sitting up over on the other side. And you're not seeing things. Degas has cropped this image in such a way that he has obliterated the face of Madame Manet. What a strange choice, right? And this won't be the last time tonight that we see him do very unusual things to the faces and heads of women. Yes, this is like a little preview of what's to come. But to give us a sense of Edward Manet and his influence on Edgar Degas, here are 2 very famous works by Edward Manet, these proto-impressionist paintings that were huge scandals in Paris in the early 1860s. We've got Luncheon on the Grass on the left, we've got Olympia on the right, And most people wouldn't look at this and say, oh, this is Impressionist, because we can still see fair amount of invisible brushwork, although some things are kind of broadly painted. And we can still see plenty of like dark browns and blacks. But what we see here primarily is an interest in modern life. So even though Edward Manet, in particular with these two works, is kind of trying to recall some elements of the history of art, he's grounded these images in aspects of modern French life. And that was a little bit jarring to French audiences at the time. Keeping in our minds this kind of jarring contrast between light and dark that we see in these paintings, let me show you what Edgar Degas was doing right around the same time. This is his 1862 painting. It's a family portrait. He did it while he was still living in Italy. And it's a really unusual family portrait. Well, first of all, this is his family. This is his aunt Laura standing. Just behind her is a portrait of Aunt Laura's father. That would have been Edgar Degas' grandfather. And he had just passed away, which is why Laura looks particularly somber and is wearing all black. So alongside Laura, she's sort of holding closely this one little girl who looks out at us. There's a second girl who the mother sort of reaches towards, but is disconnected from, both these little girls in black dresses with these startlingly white pinafores that again, also sort of seem like a preamble to the ballet, right? It almost feels like tutus in some ways, especially since this little girl in the center is sitting on one foot and she's got this little pointed foot that's sticking out. Over here on the right is the father of this family, and we can see that Degas has positioned him in a really unusual way, especially as we're thinking about a family portrait. He is sitting essentially with his back to us. His face is in profile. He is rather disconnected from his family. Nobody's looking at him, and he doesn't really seem to be looking at anybody. Then we have this little dog that's cut off by the edge of the picture frame, a room that we can just glimpse off in the distance here. There's an unsettling aspect to this picture. And, since it's the holidays and we're probably getting holiday greeting cards from friends and family right now with like happy family portraits where people have their arms around each other. And even if they're not looking out at you, they probably look like they're enjoying themselves. That's not what this is. This is really unusual. This is a family portrait that's all about psychological tension. So, where do we go from here? How do we understand Edgar Degas? Well, we can see in this next work, which was painted just shortly thereafter, this is another work that is thought to be like a portrait. It's generally referred to as woman seated beside a vase of flowers. This is from 1865. So we can see this like overwhelming floral still life, right? It's practically center in the composition. And the way it's painted and the subject matter here might remind you of Impressionist paintings, right? Then we have this woman who's kind of like crammed in on the right. And this is somebody that Degas knew. He'd gone out to her country house to visit her. She had collected these flowers. She'd just taken her gloves off and rested them there. And she's just sitting there looking pensive, seemingly unaware of the fact that she's being painted or included in this rather crowded composition. There's plenty of loose brushwork in this painting, but she's painted rather realistically. And let me tell you, in the history of art, nobody has ever painted a portrait that looks like this. You would never dwarf your subject by a giant vase of flowers this way. You would never push your subject practically outside of the frame of the picture in the way that Edgar Degas has. So what we will see again and again is real invention when it comes to his compositions. Now, this might be a work that's more familiar to many because it's in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And at first glance, it might be like, oh, okay, this feels impressionist. It's bright, it's airy, it's outside, it's a landscape, and it's horizontal. Well, it doesn't have all of those short, quick brushstrokes that we might associate with French Impressionism. This is sort of like a tried and true subject for Degas. He was interested in movement and jockeys on horses. It's a day at the races, and he's made the races like this tiny little afterthought in the middle ground over here. And what he has foregrounded for us is like this family group where a woman with a babe in arms is sitting in a carriage. There's another woman sitting alongside her, and a dog and a gentleman who are looking down at this baby who's sort of illuminated by the light of this bright day. I think that the most interesting and astounding thing about this painting is what's happening over here on the left. This is so weird. Degas is showing us a carriage, a horse-drawn carriage that is proceeding away from us, and he has cut it in half. He's only showing us half of this carriage, acting as though the other half has been cut off by the frame of the canvas. And this is him sort of toying with us. This is him taking lessons from what's happening in photography at this time and using it to inform his painting composition. Because let's face it, if you're planning a painting, you don't ever have to cut off anything at the edges. And artists before him never did that purposely, at least not in such an unusual way, right? You might have somebody sort of exiting off the edge of a picture, but this was astounding for the time. Maybe we're kind of used to it today because we all have cameras in our back pockets, and we already know that when you're taking a picture of something, it's not as easy to crop things out. But Degas had the choice. He had all the power when creating this image. And to include a funny little detail like that was so unusual for the time. So, continuing on with the thread, that Degas was very interested in, like Manet, in creating scenes about modern life. I give you 1873's The Absinthe or The Absinthe Drinkers. Now, if you're not very interested in alcohol, let me introduce you to absinthe because it was a very strong cocktail with this wormwood liqueur. It was said to have hallucinogenic properties, and it had this pale green color to it. It was known as the Green Fairy. So it was a very strong thing to drink. It was so strong, in fact, that by the end of the 19th century, people were committing crimes up to and including murder and blaming their actions on the fact that they had been drinking absinthe prior to the crime. So, in this 1873 image, we can see a woman who seems to be drinking in the middle of the day in a Parisian cafe, and she's like drunk as a skunk. And she's just sitting there in a stupor, completely disconnected from this gentleman, perhaps a male companion that's sitting alongside her. She's disconnected from everything in life. This is not a romantic subject matter by any stretch of the imagination, but Degas places us right in this cafe, almost as though we're sitting behind our own table right here. And we're just glancing at another patron. Now, I also want to draw your attention to the fact that he's using a very strong diagonal here to organize his composition. I love these tables that sort of seem to be floating in midair, right? But these strong diagonals, here's another one, would have been influenced by the prevalence, the pervasiveness of Japanese woodblock prints, which were which were eagerly consumed by the Parisian public at this time. And those were often organized by these strong diagonals. So we have Degas wedded to the subject of modern life, sort of warts and all, right? Here's another astonishing image from Edgar Degas. And again, you can see a little bit of like loose impressionist style brushwork, maybe in the background, in this sort of negative space over here. But you would never confuse this for like a Monet water lily or Monet haystack. This is mostly, blacks and browns and grays. This is 1876's Place de la Concorde. And believe it or not, this is another family portrait. This is a gentleman who is out with his two daughters and their dog. But the way Edgar Degas has composed this composition, you would never imagine that they had anything to do with each other. They're all pointing in different directions. There's no sense of connection here other than the fact that they're all kind of dressed the same, right? So we get this sort of snapshot, what feels like a photograph, right? A snapshot just of modern life and the way Parisians move about the city. And once again, Degas has cropped a figure who's over here in the margins, and he's given us all of this negative space, like nothing is happening here. And yet he reserves that space for it. So I have one last image to sort of introduce you to Degas to give you a sense and maybe an appreciation for his innovation. If you've been to one of my talks before, you've probably seen this image. I use it all the time. I think it's emblematic of what he was really capable of. This is called Women on a Cafe Terrace from 1877. This is a pastel. This is, again, another, well, it's sort of similar to the absinthe drinkers in some ways, because this is not a romantic subject or a high minded subject by any stretch of the imagination. These are courtesans who are waiting for clients on a cafe terrace. They are painted not to look beautiful, but to look a little rough and coarse and ruddy here. This is Degas giving us almost like a document of what Parisian life was like. Now, having said that, he has created a fascinating composition here, hasn't he? I mean, the way he's broken up this image just using the architecture of this cafe terrace. And you can almost imagine the central figure here is like a person on stage to some degree, maybe even making like an obscene gesture the way she's biting her thumb this way. And then you have these two other women. One of them is cut off by the edge of the composition, who almost seem to be like waiting in the wings to a certain extent. So it seems like a snapshot, it seems documentary, and it is modern life in all of its gritty reality. I mentioned stage and wings. I'm going to use this as our segue to this next important segment as we move towards the ballet. So we're going to consider Degas and his interest in women and performance. And this is a continual thread that begins before he even ever paints a tutu. So we get started with actually another kind of family portrait even. This is an image of Degas' own family. This one's called The Song Rehearsal from 1873. Degas actually spent about 6 months here in America, down in New Orleans. And so what we're looking at here is a depiction of members of his own family. So this is an upper class subject. Keep that in mind. Note too, the very strong diagonal that he uses to draw our eye back to this far corner. And we have these elegantly attired women, and they're making these kind of theatrical gestures to each other as they do this performance, probably for their own family members, right? We have a very like sort of detailed drawn door here, which we can see is in stark contrast to the blob of paint that describes the man playing the piano here. So it's in some ways almost like a rough, seemingly unfinished work, but we can see like the drama, the theatricality of these female family members. In fact, their gestures almost remind me of the Spartan boys and girls that we saw before. We're going to move on from this, and this is probably the last time we're going to see upper class subjects performing in this way. And it's worth noting that this is in like a private home. Because upper class subjects don't really perform in public. So, what happens when Edgar Degas goes back to Paris is that he starts focusing on women performing in public. Initially at cafe concerts. And cafe concerts were sort of like pre vaudeville. They were raunchy stage shows with like off color jokes and some music, maybe some poetry. And we can see these women in these brightly colored gowns up on stage, sometimes kind of garishly lit from below from those gas lights. And we can see an orchestra pit right in front of them. And here is like an easy kind of naughty joke that Degas made quite a bit when he portrayed these cafe concerts. And that is the scroll of the double bass from the music pit, sort of rising above everybody's head, kind of functioning like a phallic symbol in response to these women on stage and the kind of performances that they were giving to working class Parisians. Okay. So, this next image here is another cafe concert scene. It's called The Song of the Dog. We can see that Degas has created an image of a woman who would never be considered classically beautiful. The dyed red hair was an easy symbol at the time for a working girl or a courtesan. And notice again that uplighting, it makes her eyes look like dark sockets here. She's sort of plump, she's kind of vampy as she's bent her elbows and sort of flexed her wrists this way. So she looks a little grotesque. We can surmise that this is a really interesting performance, but none of us would necessarily aspire to be her. This next image here of a woman performing, this one's in the collection of the Harvard Art Museums, and I saw it for years before I ever really carefully considered what we were looking at here. And that black glove and the seriousness of this woman who's clearly trying to hit like an operatic note here. I always just imagined it was an opera scene, that she was a serious singer. But when you look at the series of studies that Degas did around this particular image, you can see he started with drawing. Remember, start with the drawing, lines, lines, and more lines. And he kind of works his way through various iterations here. And the most fully resolved version of this woman, we can see that he has emphasized the light and shadow on her face. He is trying to make her look cartoonish or clownish or grotesque here. There's a silliness to the idea of this cafe concert singer who's so seriously trying to hold this note in the way that she is portrayed here. There's also a little bit of clashing colors between the pink, this very pale pink dress, and the edge of the stage frame here with the red and the green and the gold. So Degas wasn't really always trying to flatter these working class subjects. And maybe this last work in this section here is our exception to this rule. This is an image from the circus, the Cirque Fernand. And we are looking at an image of a woman who is way up high, like in the rafters of this little theater here. And this is a woman named Miss Lala. And she was a circus performer who had this particular act that was called the Iron Jaw. And what she would do is like bite on a leather strap and they would hoist her very high into the air. And she's kind of gracefully hanging there. And I don't know about you, but I'm getting like sympathy jaw pain just thinking about it. And we can see with the way he has portrayed Miss Lala, especially the emphasis on this very well drawn architecture behind her, that he is not trying to diminish her in any way or make her look grotesque. Art historians think that's because he was actually pretty impressed by what she was capable of doing. So here's a real athlete, right? So this brings us to finally the ballet, real athletic performance. And I want to give us a little bit of grounding, a little bit of background when it comes to Paris and the ballet. We're going to start with this historic image here, which is a knockout of an image. This is an image of Louis XIV, the King of France. It's painted around 1701. So we're like 160 years before Degas and the ballet, 170 years, really. We're looking at this image of the French monarch. And number one, what's really important for our purposes is that the French did not invent the ballet. The Italians did, but the French sort of codified it. So if any of you ever took ballet or have family members that took ballet, they probably learned it in all of the French terms like chasse and pas de bourrée and grand jeté. That's all French, right? And it comes because the ballet became very important to the French. And even King Louis here was a ballet dancer himself, which is the best explanation for why this man is showing so much darn leg in this unbelievable portrait. I mean, when is the last time you've seen a man show this much leg? And he's standing there in a perfect fifth position, so proud of those athletic legs. Notice too, he's got red high heeled shoes on. Now, the other big data point for us here is that back when Louis XIV was dancing ballet, men men were the stars of the ballet. They were the most important performers. And this slowly changes over the time. By the time we get to like the first quarter of the 1800s, you see the rise of the romantic ballet. You see now women are the star performers and they're wearing tutus and they're dancing on point. So, in many ways, when we think of the ballet today, we're still thinking of the romantic ballet. And that only sort of came about 100 and, well, 200 years ago, I guess, at this point. So what we're looking at here is a lithograph that was used to advertise a particular ballet. I think this is around the 1840s or so. And what's kind of exceptional about this is that it wasn't a ballet that was famous because of its choreographer or its narrative or anything like that. It was a ballet that was being promoted just based on the strength of the celebrity of these four dancers. It really does become all about the women at this point. So we can see them sort of faithfully represented here. Now, the other thing that happens around mid-century or so, 1860s, is that the romantic ballet actually begins to kind of fade in terms of its popularity in France. We're looking at an image by Edgar Degas, and it's an image of ballet, of the romantic ballet. Um, we can see some nuns performing on stage. They're actually the ghosts of nuns. And and this is a particular romantic ballet that had been around for like 40 years. People were kind of over it. And you can even see that there's an audience member here who's not even looking at the show. He's using his binoculars to check out somebody in the balcony here. So if the romantic ballet and girls in tutus is like no longer really that important to France, why did Degas take it up as a subject matter? And the answer is very simple. The answer is this. France, Paris built itself this absolutely incredible opera house. It's the Palais Garnier or the Paris Opera or the Garnier Opera. It's referred to as a number of different things. It's this absolutely knock your socks off, impressive Beaux-Arts building that is even more incredible once you go inside. So now we have an element, a new element really, of French life for the upper class that becomes really important to social life. So now there's a need for operas. Now there's a need for ballets so that rich people can buy tickets and spend their money and go out and see each other and be seen. So what we're looking at here is a caricature of the Paris Ballet from right around this time. And we can see a ballerina on stage, and she looks like she's up on point, but she's kind of taking her last curtsy here. And everybody's throwing bouquets of flowers at her. And there's just another data point that I want to share with you very quickly. When you went to the ballet to see women performing, you would see something that you would never see outside walking around because women in Paris at this time would wear long sleeves and they would wear long dresses. You did not see women's unclothed bodies anywhere in Parisian society unless you went to a can-can performance. And so as we move to the right side of this image, you can see all of these men losing their minds over this woman. They are within spitting distance and still staring at her through binoculars. They're just going absolutely crazy. So these rich guys, these subscribers to the ballet, were there for the art, but they were certainly there for the ogling as well. So all of this contributes to what was happening in the notorious foyer de danse, which was the semi-public space in the opera building where these rich subscribers, which were known as adonnés, could go and meet the ballerinas and, most importantly, negotiate access to them through financial arrangements. And we can see there's even a ballerina's mother here who's involved in those negotiations. If this is giving you a little bit of an ick feeling, I mean, it's because this is like Epstein Island light, essentially, or Epstein Island, because access to these ballerinas included everything that you might think. But this was this is what a young ballerina would probably hope for because this was how they would make their living. And the reason why the mother's involved here is that an adonne could support a ballerina's entire family. So this was a real um, sort of class based reality that existed in France at this time. So you have young working class girls who are working so hard to become these like prima ballerinas so that they could be noticed and supported this way. So when we look at this next image by Edgar Degas, one of my favorite images of his about the ballet, we can see in this rear image where he's really kind of focusing on faces too, that he's giving us ballerinas that whose faces look kind of like as coarse, as ruddy as those courtesans on the terrace, right? These are working class girls, and they were known in Paris as opera rats. Even Degas referred to these young girls as my little monkeys. So like I said, there's a real class reality that was at play here. But all of these girls are hoping to kind of like make it big at the ballet. And in this image, inside the studio where they're rehearsing, it's like just a fantastic composition. Again, that very strong diagonal, taking our eye to that far back corner. And we can see Degas being really playful, really inventive with his cropping here because he's got all this space. He could have fit in as many girls as he wanted into this picture, but he's just given us three. And he's acting as though this fourth ballerina, there just wasn't room for her. All that he can possibly fit in is just this one leg that's kind of intruding into the composition from the edge here. I get such a kick out of this. It's so funny to just have this one leg kind of encroaching into the composition. But this would have been like a revelation for the time because nobody created compositions that looked like this at this moment. So we wrap up this little introduction to the Paris Ballet with this next image here, which is a pastel, and it's from an unusual perspective. I would say it's almost as though we're waiting in the wings here, and we can glimpse the stage, we can glimpse the orchestra, we can glimpse some of the audience, and we can see other dancers. And I love how they've got these very pointed toes, right? And there's something about this composition in particular that reminds me of just how much courage it takes to step out on the stage and turn and face your audience, right? He's putting us in the shoes, the ballet slippers of these young girls. So Degas takes up this subject fervently, and he sort of gets dinged by it reputation wise. He sort of becomes known as like the guy who paints the dancers, and people didn't necessarily really respect that. But he dedicates about 15 years of his life to this subject and creates about 1,500 images of ballerinas, of the ballet, in virtually every medium imaginable. So it's a pretty astonishing output. I would say he is still the painter of record when it comes to the ballet. Nobody has met or surpassed what he has was able to accomplish. I want to draw your attention to one last thing in this composition before we move on. We've got our dancers, our audience, our musicians. What's this right here? That's probably the shoulder of an adonne, one of those subscribers who's just standing right there in the wings, waiting for his ballerina to come right back to him. And this is a reality that Degas is going to explore very much in his images of the ballet. What we're going to do now is go center stage, and we're going to see Degas' images of performances. They're not going to be like what you expect because this is a man who prioritizes unusual compositions, unusual points of view, cropping, framing, zooming, all of that. So he's going to give you the unexpected. All right, so let's see what he gives us. This is one of his earliest images of the ballet. Oh my God, what an image. This is from 1870. It's called The Orchestra at the Opera. What do we have going on here? Well, we have these very realistic, very detailed faces of male musicians in the orchestra pit. And they're all hard at work. They're reading music and playing their instruments. And up above them are the bodies of these female dancers wearing these kind of effervescent tutus, right? And up above, it's not painted realistically. It's painted in this loose impressionist brushwork. It almost feels like two different paintings. But come on, he has cut off the heads of these women. This is pretty shocking, isn't it? This is a lot like what we saw before with Madame Manet, where he cuts off the face of this man's wife here. This is pretty unexpected. Now, you might be wondering, does this make him a misogynist? What did the people of Paris think? Well, I can't answer the first. I mean, I think we all sort of know, but I can tell you that the people of Paris didn't see this picture because this was actually a portrait commission of his bassoonist friend here. So it just went into his private collection. It hung in his house. Nobody saw it. But about 2 years later, Degas comes back with this image, which is very similar. He's sort of done the course correction of including the faces of his ballerinas. And I will say that this is perhaps one of the most beautiful ballerinas that he paints. I would say through his entire career. She's just this lovely girl, and she's taking her curtsy here. Notice that she's the star, right? But he puts her off to the side. And once again, we have this shocking contrast, really, in terms of the difference in the way he's painted the men and the women. There's realism down below and masculinity, and there's this light, airy effervescence up above in the way that he's painted these women with the impressionist brushstrokes. And he's kind of married these two scenes together. He's like stitched them together with the violin bows that we can see, and you know, the top of, what is this, a clarinet or a bassoon? I don't think that's a clarinet. Over here on the right. And let's think of the perspective too, because it's almost as though we're in the orchestra pit now. We're sitting right behind these musicians. We could practically read their sheet music with them. So he's being inventive all along the way. This next image here is in the Art Institute of Chicago. This is a pastel, probably maybe a monotype that he modified as well. And what we're looking at here is, well, art historians debate whether it's a performance or a rehearsal. I tend to think it's a performance. We have a woman up on point over here. I love that her tutu sort of sparkles as well. But again, the center of the action is kind of pushed off to the side. We can see a row of ballerinas over here that are sort of punctuated by the scroll work of the double bass that, sort of like those cafe concerts that we saw before, rises above the heads of the musicians here. Is he creating that same dirty joke that he used before? I leave that to you to decide. I think most art historians would say, oh, it's a different context. This is like an upper class subject now. No, it's not the dirty joke, but we'll see he uses it quite a bit. We can see the tops of the heads of the people who I presume are in the orchestra pit. They're not rendered as realistically, but they are fascinating nonetheless, particularly this one face that's turned upwards with the eyes closed. So he's giving us, again, an unusual perspective, an interest in this contrast between men and women, maybe even a dirty joke here. This next image is another dancer who is taking her final bow. She's curtsying with her hands out on the edges of her tutu. And look at the way he's painted the light here. This is gaslight. This is, you know, this is not the best lighting any of us would choose for a portrait or for an image like this. And she isn't rendered as beautiful as some of those other ballerinas that we just saw. She looks more like a singer in a cafe concert. There are several rows of dancers in tutus behind her. And in this moment of, you know, triumph and achievement at the end of her performance, she's also holding on to a bouquet of flowers. And now, instead of having the orchestra pit being like our mediator to the stage, Degas gives us this upper class woman who we see in almost like a three-quarter profile turned away from us. And she's kind of peeking at this performance over the top of her open fan. So the fan becomes this one arch that is kind of echoed by the white arch of the tutu here. There's this fascinating contrast. And then look at the jewelry sort of dripping from her ears here. It's this beautiful blue stone. It's the exact same color as the flowers. So Degas is like prodding us to think about the class realities here. A working class girl on stage with something beautiful that's going to quickly fade, and then a wealthy woman in the audience with jewels that will last a lifetime, right? So a very interesting contrast here. We'll wrap up our look at center stage performances with that image that we started with tonight. This one is called The Star. And it is a glorious, an exultant image of dancing. This is a dancer who's in like that state of flow. This is from 1876. The image is in the collection of the Musée D'Orsay in Paris. And we, as viewers, are kind of looking down at her as though we're in a balcony, but she is at the far end of the stage. We can see the wings behind her. There's plenty of negative space here. Her arms are open. Presumably her back leg is raised in an arabesque. And there is this feeling of like joy, of triumph on her face as she is just like nailing her part in this ballet. And it's like that connection to the best part of dancing here. There's also this black like choker that's tied around her throat, and it's sort of waving off to the side, um, suggesting that there's a lot of movement here. So I almost get the effect that she's twirling or doing a pirouette and paused with this arabesque, and that ribbon is still kind of moving here. It brings our eye over to what's happening in the wings. We can see the feet of other ballerinas, girls who will presumably run out on stage the second the star is done with her solo. But we also see the feet of the Adonais, who's waiting right there at the edge of the wings as well. So we can imagine this girl twirling off stage right into this man's presence, and that feeling of joy and triumph just dissipating into the air immediately, and that unimaginable shift from the joy of the performance to the reality of that kind of relationship. So Degas is giving us so much in this image. It's really kind of unbelievable to comprehend, isn't it? So he doesn't give us many images of stage performances. What we're going to do now is turn our attention to a more private view of the ballet, something that very few people would have had access to, the dress rehearsals and going backstage. And for our culture today, we're kind of accustomed to backstage peeks at things. If there's anything that we feel like is off limits or we haven't seen before, there's usually some sort of special on TV that gives us a backstage pass, right? We know what things look like backstage, but there's still the fascination with the things that you're not supposed to see, the machinery that makes things work. And that's what Degas gives us a lot of when it comes to the ballet. We have to like keep in mind most of Paris didn't see this. And also, we have this almost like startling contrast with the idea that these very well trained ballerinas were supposed to look perfect on stage. And then he's showing us rehearsals where they look like this, and it's all still a little messy, right? So, what we're looking at here, we can see a man on the stage. This is Jules Perrault, who was like a world-class choreographer and trainer of the ballerinas. And he seems to be coaching, in particular, a dancer over here who's up on point. Many other dancers are on stage, and we can see the set around them. They're wearing their tutus, but they aren't doing anything. They're waiting there, kind of patient, kind of bored. She's like hanging off of the scenery. She's yawning. She's stretching over here. And this one is seated on a bench. and she's kind of fiddling with her hair behind her. You've probably already noticed that there are two Adonais sitting right there with this priority access to the rehearsal, and are probably right there next to the girls that they have sponsored. Those Adonais, I think, interestingly, are sort of counterbalanced by the scroll work of the double basses, which are rising up into this composition from the orchestra pit. Uh, Now, I mentioned before we'd see a lot of evidence of Degas' drawing in this program. And with these two images, which are in premier museum collections, I believe the one on the right or the one on the left is at the Musée D'Orsay, the one on the right is at the Met, I think. And you can see they're almost the exact same thing. They're very easy to confuse, but there's just these tiny little variations to them. Most notably, that the one on the left is like a grayscale work, it's grisaille. So we can see that Degas is using almost the exact same characters from one image to the next, almost the exact same poses, right? So these are characters, figures that he has developed very well through drawings that he's able to populate in different kinds of work. So it's easy to get confused about some of his images of the ballet because they can be so similar. He's taken out one of the Adonais, he's taken out Perrault, he's taken out even the double bass scroll work here. So it's a simpler composition. Another image I'm going to show you will almost feel like a tighter, more closely cropped image of what we see over here. He's taken out anything extraneous. We've got our choreographer on stage, we've got the dancer that he is coaching, and we've got our Adonai who has like stepped into the scene and he's standing right there within arm's length of his ballerina. Notice too that Degas is showing us the rear end of a dancer who's hunched over adjusting her ballet slipper. This is not the way people were accustomed to seeing their prima ballerinas at the Paris Opera. These are sometimes awkward and ungainly poses, in addition to being unguarded. So he's giving us a real taste of the reality of this. And then he takes us backstage. We're literally behind the scenery now. We can see these two girls in their lovely costumes. This one's called In the Wings, referring, I believe, to the element of this element of the theater, not the fact that the girl is wearing the butterfly wings here, but they've got these gorgeous costumes. We can see that Degas is not trying to make them classically beautiful, but maybe leaning more towards the reality and more towards his images of working class girls. And again, it's another kind of ungainly pose. She's leaning on something, she's hunched over herself. We think of ballerinas in the most graceful, difficult poses we could ever imagine. And that's not what he's giving us here at all. He said at one point that the reason he loved painting the images of the ballet was the opportunity essentially to paint movement and beautiful costumes. Here's where he really gives us the beautiful costumes. In this next image, or in these next two images, we're still in the wings, and notably with Adonais in both of these images, the idea of these men literally standing in line with the ballerinas who are ready to go out on stage. How jarring and unsettling must that have been to these young girls? In fact, this young woman over here in the pink tutu seems to almost be like cradling herself here, trying to ignore this man in the top hat. But over here on the right, it's like he seems like he's not even registering among these women. They seem like they are preparing to run out on stage. You even get a sense of the lights just outside of this composition. And to me, there's almost like a little bit of humor here. Like he is standing in line with the girls as though he's about to join them and run out on stage and dance a number with them. So of course, Degas thinks of that too. And he gives us this fascinating work that's called The Curtain. This one's from 1880, so it's a little bit later for him. This one's at the National Gallery of Art. And so what's happening here? The girls have gone off stage. The back curtain of the Paris Opera has been sort of lifted here. We can see the girls' legs underneath it. And again, seeing women's legs at this time period would have been a very erotic thing for people. And now we see the Adonais coming out from the wings. They are standing center stage during this rehearsal, but it's almost as though they are the show themselves now, right? And the girls are sort of subsidiary to that. We do have this one female dancer in the foreground who looks like she's kind of desperate to get away from this guy. All right, enough of the Adonais, right? We're all thoroughly creeped out now. We're going to go to an even more private space, which is the studios where the dancers would train and practice. So this is a space that that really no one had access to. And I forgot to mention, Edgar Degas himself had to become an Adonai in order to get some of this backstage access that we saw with the rehearsals. For the studio space, I mean, sometimes he had to beg, borrow, and steal in order to get permission to go in and sketch from life the ballerinas at work. Now, most of the images that I think most of us are most familiar with are images of ballerinas, maybe one or two of them practicing in a studio. Those were the images that he produced most prolifically. I'm going to show you a couple of his most complex scenes of these studio practices because I think it really kind of gives you the full understanding of his capability as an artist. So what we're looking at here is a rehearsal in the studio. It's one of his most complicated compositions. We kind of start over here with a dancer who we see from behind. Notice the little dog down below. And then we have almost like a ribbon unfurling and winding its way towards the background. There's about 20 people in this composition, all the way up here to where we can see two women hugging. But in the center of all of this negative space, we have Jules Perrault again, and he looks like he is coaching or possibly examining this one dancer here whose feet are in this prepared position. So what's kind of fascinating here is that Degas gives us, again, an unvarnished view of what these ballerinas are like when they're not on stage. We've got a girl who's kind of scratching herself, another one who's fiddling with her ear, another one that might even be like biting her nails. Maybe she's nervous, maybe she's next. So again, these are not ways that you would have normally seen these dancers. They would have been expected to, be performing flawlessly on stage. You wouldn't see them sitting around scratching themselves when you went to the Paris Opera. And again, to kind of reinforce that notion of how Degas himself practiced so much with the drawing here. Here's another image of the rehearsal, a very similar composition, and Jules Perrault is essentially the same character. He's fully developed this figure and can plop him into different compositions. One of the big changes over here is Perrault is working with a dancer who's now in arabesque. And over here in the foreground, we have a girl who has hiked up the back of her tutu and somebody behind her is adjusting her costume. So we move on from these scenes of rehearsals to another very dense, very complicated scene in the studio where we can see way back into depth. There are women who are at the bar. There are women who are doing floor work at the center of the composition. Over here on the far left, up above, we have girls descending a spiral staircase. Perhaps you could take this as another example of Edgar Degas cutting off women's heads. I find it kind of comical just to see these feet coming into the composition. And then counterbalancing that in like a sort of a diagonal composition, we have some women who are at rest, maybe having a conversation, a girl sitting here still in second position. And then once again, Degas is giving us a girl hunched over. We see her rear end right there, smack in the center of his composition. Now, again, you might think, what does he really think of these young girls if he's willing to portray them this way? I mean, we see the effort, we see the work, we see some exhaustion too, but there is like a level of silliness or ridiculousness or just I'm not sure that lends itself to a composition like this. Now, I think for the most part, we are familiar with images similar to these. On the right, we have an image from the Metropolitan Museum of Art where there's a young girl who is um, presumably practicing at the bar. She's got an accompanist here, and I'm just going to zoom in on her face for you because there's some amazing side eye there. She's really kind of carefully watching him and keeping track of the musical count, presumably. Over on the left, we have two women who aren't sort of moving through the movements, but instead are seemingly like lounging slash stretching. Seems like an informal moment. And and we can see like their feet are turned out. There's beauty to what they're doing, but it's again not something that you would ever see happen on stage. All of this is kind of counterbalanced by the image of a watering can. And you might be wondering, what's up with the watering can? There's actually already been one in one of these images. And I guess it was a ubiquitous element of these studios because apparently from all of these girls jumping and dancing and probably Peru there with his stick, there was a lot of dust coming up from the floor. So they would literally water the floor to dissipate the dust. It's hard to imagine, and I would think it would make it much more difficult to dance on, right? So with this particular image, Degas apparently sort of leaned into the metaphor of like the stretching leg over here, kind of looking like this watering can. When he eventually gave this image to his art dealer, he looked at it and he said, oh, this is too obvious a metaphor. I'm going to paint out the watering can. And his art dealer wouldn't let him do that. So there's a little joke in this image. Now, one last image of the studio. We've got this pastel here. Isn't this a knockout of a composition? It's simply called Waiting, and it's a study of contrast, right? We've got a girl in a white tutu, we've got a woman in a black dress. The girl is sort of flattened, her feet are wide in that second position, her back is flat as she's hunched over. Degas paints this pose so many times during this period of his career. Art historians refer to this pose as being cuboid. The woman, in contrast, is all sharp edges. There's like this nervous energy to her, in contrast to maybe a sense of exhaustion from the ballerina. She's got the sharp edges of her elbows, her toes, her body's extended by the shape of this umbrella, too. And we can't really see their faces. But what we can see is that this woman is hunched over and she's holding onto her ankle. And so maybe it's sore, or maybe she's injured. Maybe this is her mother who's now thinking, if this is an injury, how does this impact our entire family? So much is at stake here, right? And now, just an image of two women sitting on a bench is imbued with all of this psychological tension, right? Or it could just be two strangers in the studio who are sitting next to each other. We'll never know. But this beautiful visual contrast between the two of them, I think, is just so successful. So we are going to wrap up with one last medium for Edgar Degas, and that is the medium of sculpture. We're going to zero in on the little ballerina, age 14. Now, you might be thinking, sculpture? Okay, so Edgar Degas did a number of sort of like tabletop figurines of ballerinas. Notice they don't have tutus. Now, these are nudes, but look at how graceful these poses are. Imagine how challenging these poses would be to sustain in order for him to sculpt them. All of these little figurines were made out of beeswax, and they were cast in bronze after his death. But the sculpture for which he is best known is this one here. This is the little ballerina, age 14. This is the only sculpture that Degas ever exhibited in his entire life. And for an artist who is interested in the real world, in realism and modernity, this was a shockingly realistic sculpture. It's about 2/3 life size, so she stands at about 3 feet tall. It's mixed media. It has real hair. It has real tutu. It has a real bodice here. It even has real ballet slippers. And she is carved out of beeswax. So this was a work of startling realism. Now, stay with me for just a second, because when I look at this image of this little ballerina, there's a part of me that's reminded of what Degas did when he was just an art student back in Italy, when he could sort of select someone out of a group and crop and zoom and have us really consider somebody who is undervalued and overlooked, like a 14-year-old girl, perhaps in a dance corps. And perhaps that's what he's doing here is he's just training our eye on this little girl who would have otherwise been overlooked. Let me give you a couple of different views of this sculpture so you can sort of see it in the round here. She is standing in a relaxed fourth position, but from my perspective, otherwise, there's not much about this that looks balletic to me. There's some interesting analysis from dancers who have looked at this sculpture, and they say she looks like somebody who's well trained but exhausted, somebody who's been working hard all day. And so we can see some of her ballet form kind of slipping here. She has a little belly, or like her hips are kind of pushed forward in which would have been happening if she was fatigued. This clasping of her hands behind her back is not necessarily a ballet move here, but it kind of expands this little chest, the shoulders that she has, and we can see that her chin is lifted very high. As we zoom in on her face here, we can see that her eyes are almost closed. Again, there's nothing about that that's particularly ballet per se. Now, this is a work that was not instantly loved. In fact, this little girl, who I think many people kind of cherish these days, she was initially unanimously received as ugly. She was, in part because she was uncomfortably realistic, but critics of the day dismissed her as being repulsive. One critic called her a threat to society, if you can believe that. People were much more accustomed to traditional depictions of female beauty. I mean, they wanted goddesses at this time. And this little girl reminded the Parisian public of opera rats, of the little monkeys that Edgar Degas was painting, right? So the response to this was so hostile that Edgar Degas took this sculpture off view, put it in a closet in his studio, and nobody saw it again for the next 40 years. And it wasn't until he passed away in 1917 that his heirs discovered it and kind of represented it to the world that was now ready to see this. And she became this celebrated little figure. And she was this beeswax sculpture here was cast in bronze, multiple copies made. Now there's a replica of her in museums all around the world. She's one of the most celebrated images of the ballet, but man, she started as a scandal. So now we have Edgar Degas' final curtain. I know I've had you for a long time tonight, so I'll make it short and sweet. We have Edgar Degas, a man who strived to be or aspired to be a history painter. In the end, he gave us something much more vital. He shows us a visual history of dancers and performers navigating a world of art and labor and sometimes even survival. His fascination with ballerinas produced some of the art world's most beloved images. But when it comes to Degas, we know these aren't just pretty pictures. He's always offering up a new perspective and deeper truths about the realities of modern life. I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments that you have about Edgar Degas and all these ballerinas. Thank you so much for your time and attention, everybody. All right, I'm going to start going through, let's see, the Q&A here first. Let's see. Barb says, I heard that Manet originally cropped that picture. The strip was added afterwards. Oh, Barb, thank you so much for adding it. That I did not know. So that would have been Manet and his wife. It was actually the husband depicted that might have cropped out his wife. Thank you, Barb, for adding that. Okay, that could change things here. Thank you. We have an anonymous attendee who said, in the races painting, there seems to be a small image or images opposite the woman and the baby. Looks like small mini paintings. Why is that? Let's see if I can find what you're referring to. Go back to Day at the Races. Small mini paintings. Let's see here. I'm making a mess of all the chats in front of me. Sorry about that. Huh. I'm not sure if I know what you mean. Maybe like these little figure groupings over here. And I think he's just trying to give us like a little bit of a slice of life. But his protagonists are the people in this carriage. I think that's what you might be referring to. I'm not sure I made that any more clear. Thanks for getting us to look at it a little bit more closely. Somebody else says these are not data points, they are points of interest, right? Possibly. Thank you. Either way. Somebody else said, I thought that his final paintings were cropped from larger sketches and included things like extra legs and the top of the musical instruments. His final paintings cropped from larger sketches. That could very well be the case. It's hard to say that that could be true for every single one of them, and it's hard for me to know without looking at the sketches and the images. But um, even the comment from earlier about, a strip being added to something. Sometimes Manet, this is like, or sorry, Degas, fascinatingly would add strips of paper or material to the edges of his compositions to expand it in certain directions. So in addition to cropping, sometimes he was expanding. So what you're saying is probably very true, but it would, for me to say yes or no, I think we'd have to be looking at specific works. I'm not sure if that was always the way he operated. Somebody else said, why are his paintings so rough, just painted quickly? It's a really good question. It seems, well, I think that's really that kind of impressionist element that factors into his body of work. And it's interesting because I've given this presentation a couple of times in person to different audiences this month. And I could tell that there were like a few women in particular who were like almost wounded by the fact that he didn't want to call himself an impressionist. They're like, why wouldn't he want to be an impressionist? And and I think in the end he had his own reasons, right? But I think the reason why today we still categorize him as an impressionist is because there seems to be a quickness and an immediacy and a sketchiness to a lot of his works, and especially some of those ballet images that we saw. So thank you for that question. I think it helps to kind of flesh out that concept a little. Carla says, is the black ribbon on the ballerina in the star deliberately pointing to the benefactor? Carla, I tend to think so. I think we could interpret it that way. I like your reading of it. I think it's easy to make that case. I mean, it's the other black element in that composition, right? It seems to tie her to him in that way. I've jumped past it. There we go. Yeah. Joel Schwimmer says, please spell Adonne. It would be, I think it's one D. So it would be Adonn. And I think it's like E accent aigu, if I'm remembering my French correctly. Somebody else says, in his own time, did Degas change the way that people thought about ballet? Did these backstage images demystify the form? Great question. I don't think I have a great answer for you on that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if demystify is the right word. I mean, I think he made it more familiar. I'm not sure if there was like a mystery around that because particularly because these were working class girls and they weren't thought of very highly. So maybe if anything, I would think that his images helped to kind of elevate the way people looked at them because he showed so much of the effort and the work and the exhaustion that went into what they did. My that would be my hunch, but I'm not entirely sure. You ask a great question. Mary asks or says, I'm amazed that the beeswax didn't melt in storage. Right? It seems as though like there has to be something else there to hold these things together. But yeah, all of these sculptures of the ballerinas made out of beeswax, and they were just kept in his studio for decades before they were cast in bronze. It's kind of amazing. Somebody said, why were the ballerinas painted like an impressionist, but the audience realistically? I don't know if I have the answer as to why. I think, there's a sense of movement there with his rapid execution, um, particularly when we go back to yes, this one here. There's a sense of like the material too of the tutus. I mean, in this case, it's also a portrait commission, but it does seem as though other factors are at hand, perhaps in terms of the way he regarded the work of the two different genders represented. Sort of says the cynical side of me. Um, that's part of an answer, I guess. Nancy says, who is the model for the little dancer sculpture? Did Degas have an arrangement with one of the opera rats? Really good question. I'm not sure if we have her name. Maybe somebody else might know. Um, I'm not sure if we know. Oh, no, we do know her name. And we do know some things about her, if I'm remembering correctly. I think if I'm not conflating different ballerina stories, I don't think that she stayed with the ballet much longer after this. So I will say, if you want to sort of pursue her story, the original ballerina, little ballerina, age 14, is in the collection of the National Gallery of Art in DC. And they have a great deal of information about her. The other copies, like at the MFA, those were cast after Degas' death. And I think they might have sort of the postscript on this little girl's life. And if I'm remembering it correctly, I'm not even going to try to tell the story because I'm not entirely sure I'm remembering it accurately. But if what I'm remembering is correct, it's rather tragic. Oh, hate to say that. Um, oh, I think maybe going back to the date, the races, somebody says the carriage lights. I'm just going to go back and check really quickly. Carriage lights. Oh, that inside the carriage light there could be like its own little story, or maybe some sort of refraction of light. Interesting. Thanks for getting us to look at that a little bit more closely. I'm not entirely sure, but it does seem like there's a little story playing out in there. Thanks for drawing our attention to it. I'm not sure if there's any particular significance to it, but it does seem like he is trying to capture something in there. I would guess it's like the refraction of light. Suzanne says, when did the ballet become dominated by professionals in Paris? So that lithograph of the four women who were like the stars there, that was from 1845. So by that time, we know that like women were the celebrities of the Paris ballet. By the time Degas so that's several decades before Degas and his ballerinas. By the time he's doing his ballerinas, really, you have the rise of like the Russian ballet. That was really considered the preeminent ballet in the world. So maybe that answers some of your question. Um, Someone else says, was Degas a political commenter of the times? Did he champion the working girls? Well, my instinct is to say, no, he did not, because he did not flatter them in any way. Perhaps on some level, you could say just by depicting them, he is championing them, but I don't think he very frequently made them sympathetic subjects. And I think some of his own statements about women were so troubling that it doesn't seem like he had a great deal of empathy for his subjects. Like at one point later on in his life, oh, I hate to even share this, but he basically said, oh, I've always kind of thought of women as animals. So, so I don't think we can necessarily think of him as a champion of working girls, although there is something to be said for the fact that he focused on them and elevated them to a subject worthy of our gaze. Somebody else says, were the ballerinas as young as they look? Girls started training for the ballet back then as young as 7 or 8. I don't think they were necessarily performing on the stage, but they might have been in some of those studio scenes that we saw. So if they look young, they were young. Michael says the creepy element of Degas' work continued with his voyeuristic images of women bathing. Is he considered lecherous by art historians? Michael, yes. Yes. Um, Though, so for after Degas sort of stops doing the ballet as a subject, he starts doing these female nudes where it's like women bathing, sometimes almost as though he's like looking through like a keyhole to glimpse women bathing, oftentimes asking them to sustain very difficult and uncomfortable poses. Um, yeah, I mean, even his fellow artists said he was really problematic when it came to women. So, yeah, I think there's kind of a strange voyeuristic element to this at the very least. I'm not sure if lecherous is right, but definitely voyeuristic and misogynistic, probably. Linda says, I don't remember her name, but she kind of fell off the historical map. Some fiction has been written about her. Oh, probably the little ballerina age 14. Thanks for sharing that, Linda. Going to go over to the chat and let's see here, going up to, let's see, oh, where everybody's from. Thanks for adding that in. Let's see. Mary says, I heard that Manet actually, okay. Sandy says, Manet did not care for Degas' representation of his wife's face. Oh, so that's why you cut it off. Thank you so much for adding that. I'm going to have to change out that part of my program. Thank you, everybody. Um, And Joel said, or Holly said, no male dancers. This was, well, apparently with the romantic ballet, it's all about the women. The ladies were dominating on stage. So that's why Degas focused on them. And Teresa, I love that you got to see some of your favorites tonight. Um, Linda says, I've heard he made many of his ballet dancer images to earn money to pay off his brother's gambling debts and help the family save face. So I mentioned before he was very wealthy and he didn't have to have a job. Yes, he inherited a lot of family debt sort of after he became an artist, which did put some pressure on to actually finally sell things. So maybe he felt like I can't stay with these history paintings that nobody's buying. And these were very popular even during his lifetime. He could sell them. So, Linda, I think there's something to what you've shared there. Thank you so much for sharing that. Pam says, oh, okay. Oh, thank you very, very kindly for all of these very nice things that you're saying. I appreciate it. And I hope Nancy Parker, if you're still on, she told me how she was going to enjoy tonight's presentation. So I hope you enjoyed um, your snack. um, Thank you, everybody, for these very kind words. I'm just seeing if there's anything else, any other. Okay. Pam says, do you have tapes of your talks available at the library for withdrawal? Pam, you're good to ask. If you go on YouTube and look up Chelmsford TV, I think all of the recordings are saved and shared via Chelmsford TV. So you can find many, many presentations that way. So available online. All right. Thank you, everybody, for the very, very kind words. I do appreciate it. Thank you for your time, for your interest, for your contributions to the discussion. These are like the highlight of my month. I so appreciate you. We'll be back again next month. We'll be doing a big overview of American art at 250 years. So it'll be a nice survey of American art. And that's basically the last Thursday of every month. So I will see you then. And happy holidays, everybody. And I appreciate you. Take good care, and I will see you in the new year. Thank you.